The 400 years of affliction and enslavement in Genesis 15:13-14 refers to America, not ancient Egypt. Genesis 15:13-14 contains a powerful prophecy where YIH speaks to Abram, later Abraham, foretelling that his descendants would be afflicted in a foreign land for 400 years. The commonly accepted interpretation of this prophecy has been that it refers to the Israelites' time in Egypt before their liberation under Moses. However, upon closer examination of biblical timelines, historical records, and current socio-political realities, a compelling case can be made that the 400 years of affliction actually refers to the experience of African Americans in the United States, rather than the Israelites in Egypt. 1. The Genesis 15:13-14. Prophecy, the promise of affliction. In Genesis 15:13-14, YA tells Abram, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation they serve, and afterward they will come out with great possessions." Genesis 15:13-14. This prophecy indicates that the descendants of Abraham would suffer slavery and oppression in a land that was not their own for 400 years. Many scholars have historically understood this to refer to the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt, which is recorded in Exodus. However, the biblical text and historical records provide a broader lens through which this prophecy might also be understood to refer to the African Americans' experience in the United States. 2. Understanding the 430 years of sojourn. Exodus 12:40 and other biblical sources. Exodus 12:40 states, "Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. This passage has often been understood as indicating the total time of the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt, but there is a nuance in how this period is understood across different sources. The Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus all indicate a 430-year total sojourn, which includes the time the Israelites spent in Canaan prior to entering Egypt. According to these sources, the Israelites lived in Canaan for approximately 215 years before the famine brought them into Egypt, where they stayed for another 215 years. Thus, the 430-year period should be divided into two parts: 215 years in Canaan and 215 years in Egypt. However, this 430-year timeline does not necessarily mean the full period of affliction and enslavement occurred in Egypt. The Bible specifies that the 400 years of affliction would be spent in a foreign land, not necessarily in slavery, for the entirety of that time. 3. The nature of the Israelites' bondage in Egypt. While the Israelites were in Egypt for 215 years, they did not experience significant oppression until the rise of a new Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. Exodus 1:8. Before this, they lived in the land of Goshen, a fertile area in Egypt that allowed them to thrive and grow as a people. It wasn't until the birth of Moses, when Pharaoh's fear of the growing Israelite population led to their subjugation, that the Israelites truly began to experience hardship and enslavement. In light of this, the 400 years of affliction mentioned in Genesis 15 could be interpreted as referring specifically to the period of bondage, not the entire duration of the Israelites' sojourn in Egypt. If we subtract the time spent in Goshen, the Israelites were likely subjected to slavery and affliction in Egypt for much less than 215 years. This creates a gap in the timeline that aligns more closely with the experience of African Americans in America. The arrival of African slaves in America in 1619 In 1619, the first enslaved Africans were brought to the British colonies in what would later become the United States of America. This marked the beginning of a long and brutal history of racial oppression, slavery, and discrimination that continued for over 400 years. If we consider the prophecy in Genesis 15 to be fulfilled in the context of African Americans, this 400-year period would align with the arrival of the first African slaves in America in 1619. The 400 years of affliction, as described in Genesis, would encompass the full period from 1619 to the present day, culminating in the significant social and political movements of the 1960s, such as the Civil Rights Movement, and the ongoing struggle for racial equality that continues to this day. In this light, the prophecy appears to point directly to the experience of African Americans in the United States, who have endured a long history of enslavement, segregation, disenfranchisement, and systemic racism. Eindaude, the fulfillment of the prophecy in America. There are several key aspects of the Genesis 15 prophecy that correspond to the African American experience in America. The foreign land, the descendants of Abraham, through their African roots, were taken to a land that was not their own. The Americas, a foreign land far removed from their ancestral homes in Africa. Enslavement and oppression. African Americans endured centuries of enslavement, a brutal form of oppression, much like the Israelites' bondage in Egypt. Yah's judgment on the nation. In Genesis 15, Yah promises to bring judgment on the nation that enslaves his people. 6. No other nation fulfills the prophecy. No other nation or people group fulfills the conditions set forth in Genesis 15 as precisely as the African Americans. While the Israelites' 400 years of affliction were historically associated with Egypt, this was not a perfect fit, given the complexities of their sojourn in Canaan and Goshen. On the other hand, the African American experience in America aligns more directly with the 400 years of affliction and oppression foretold by God to Abraham. Conclusion. Genesis 15:13-14 foretells a period of 400 years in which the descendants of Abraham would experience affliction and enslavement in a foreign land. While this prophecy has traditionally been linked to Egypt, the biblical timeline, historical records, and the lived experience of African Americans provide a compelling case for the prophecy's fulfillment in America. The 400 years of affliction endured by African Americans, beginning with their forced arrival in 1619 and continuing through the legacy of slavery, segregation, and ongoing struggles for equality, mirrors the prophetic words of Genesis 15 with remarkable precision. Additional passages to consider. Apocalypse of Abraham, chapter 32, verse 3-6:3. And they will go out into an alien land, and they will enslave them, and oppress them as for 1 hour of the impious age. But of the nation fifth whom they shall serve, I am the judge. And the Lord said this too. Have you heard, Abraham, what I told you, what your tribe will encounter in the last days? Ladder of Jacob, 5:16-17:16. Know, Jacob, that your descendants will be exiles in a strange land, and they will afflict them with slavery, and inflict wounds on them every day. 17. But the Lord will judge the people, for whom they slave. The two great American eclipses of 2017 and 2024 created a TAV across the country. We know that the Tav is the last letter in the Hebrew alphabet, which is equivalent to the numerical representation of 400. Also, we must remember the Revelation 12 sign that appeared in the sky September 2017. These once-in up to 7,000-year events shouldn't be taken lightly. They help to highlight the significance of who the actual chosen people are in the last days.